Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm just getting my screen set here. Sorry about that. Okay. So we're so glad to have everybody here tonight. We're going to go ahead and get started. We'll start out with a few kind of housekeeping introduction things, and then we'll jump right into our topic tonight of parasite management and pasture health. So tonight's presentation is a really fun and unique partnership between Cornell Small Farms Program's Farm Ops program, which is their veteran education initiative, and our program within Cornell Cooperative Extension, the Southwest New York Dairy, Livestock, and Field Crops team. Our team is a partnership between Cornell University and the 5 CCE associations of Erie, Chautauqua, Cattaraugus, Allegheny, and Steuben counties. We have a team of 4 specialists, and we typically work with commercial dairy, livestock, and field crops producers. But with the support of Farm Ops, we're able to offer these workshops to other types of producers as well, and outside of our 5-county region. A general disclaimer is that, this information is for educational purposes only, and it shouldn't replace, especially for this topic, shouldn't replace any types of advice that you might get from proper veterinary care. So we always ask that you read and follow the labels on any pesticide and medication applications that you're using. And we're really trying to provide the best research-based information that we can, but Amy and I are human, so errors are definitely possible. Tonight, leading this presentation will be myself, Caitlin Wally-Stoll, and I'm the Farm Business Management Specialist for our team. I focus on kind of paperwork, people, and profit is what I say, so do more of the business management side of farming. I also own a small diversified livestock farm where we do raise goats, so and have pastures that we manage, so have a little bit of life experience there too. Amy, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself here?
Sure thing. Hi, everybody. My name is Amy Barkley. I'm the Livestock and Beginning Farm Specialist with the Southwest New York team. I get to do super fun stuff like pasture management and working with all the livestock species, including poultry. So marketing of products and production of products and product quality falls into that as well. So in my personal life, I also have a farm. We do heritage poultry, eggs, chicken meat, pullets, and we also have a market garden, orchard, and apiary. So we're quite diversified. We're just getting started. So it's really fun to be part of that as well as the work that I do. It complements it nicely. So thank you for having me tonight, and looking forward to speaking with you in the second half of the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So as we mentioned, tonight's topic is all about parasite management and pasture health. We will try to wrap up at 7:30 as advertised, but these are 2 really big topics with a ton of information. What we've tried to do here is give you a few tidbits of those information to help get you started. But on that previous slide, mine and Amy's contact information is there, and we do encourage you to reach out if you have any follow-up questions on topics that we don't get a chance to get to. A couple other housekeeping things. First, this is being recorded, so we will be sharing the webinar, the slides, and any other videos that we referenced tonight with everybody who registered as a participant. And we really do encourage questions as we go along. Don't feel like you have to wait until the end to ask them. So feel free to use either the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or the chat box at the bottom of your screen, whatever you feel more comfortable using. And with 2 of us, we are going to try to keep an eye on those. So if questions pop up, we will go ahead and answer them. Finally, because this is a large group, we've got everybody's video is turned off and everybody's sound is turned off. So if you do have questions, please use the chat box or the Q&A box to get a hold of us. Okay, so now getting into everything that you guys are here to learn about. So tonight we're going to cover the why. Why bother putting goats on pasture? What are the advantages of it? What are the disadvantages of it? We're going to talk about managing productive pastures, giving a little bit of an introduction to some different ways that we can manage pasture systems. And then Amy's going to talk about internal parasites within goats and IPM, which is integrated pest management. We do want to mention too that this webinar, we're going to be focusing on goat production, but many of these principles and these topics can be applied to other animals, especially sheep, but as well for any other animals that you might be grazing or might be thinking about grazing. These are all topics that are going to be helpful in those situations too. If you haven't been to any of our webinars, you'll notice that Amy and I are big fans of polls as a way to kind of gauge who we are talking to. So popping up on your screen right now should be a poll question, and we want to know who you are. So are you already raising goats? Is there already a goat in your garage or your shed or your barn or your truck bed? Are you pretty close to raising goats, but you're not there yet? So maybe you don't have the goat, but you think you've committed yourself to doing that? Do you want more information before you fully commit to raising goats, or did you accidentally sign up for the wrong webinar? So I'll leave this up here for a second, and you guys can go ahead and select which option feels like it fits you the most. All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll, and let me go ahead and share the results too, so you can see them. We've got an even split. So for those of you who accidentally signed up for the wrong seminar, no problem. Maybe you want to learn about goats just in case, in which case you're welcome to stay. We've got some people that are looking for more information, some people that are pretty close to raising goats, and others that are already raising goats. So we welcome all of you here tonight. Okay. So now we're going to talk about why you might consider wanting to raise goats on pasture. So some advantages to using pasture, and by pasture we do mean grazing animals within limits. So this is, a field that you have a fence around, a wooded area that you might have a fence around, and that you are intentionally allowing these animals to get a portion of their nutrition off of that fenced in area. So some advantages of pasturing or grazing goats and animals from our perspective, there's easier manure management. So for anybody who's raised animals in a barn, whether that's on a bedded pack or something that you're cleaning out more regularly, it's really hard to manage that manure depending on your system. And it's something that you have to do often. If an animal's out grazing, they're just pooping wherever they want to, and it's fertilizing the ground where it lands. And it's not anything that you have to think about managing. Raising animals on pasture also cuts down on your stored feed use. So here in Western New York, there are a couple months throughout the year where we do have to rely on stored forages. It's hard to graze goats when the snow is taller than them. And we rely on those stored forages to make sure our animals are still getting high quality nutrition, even in the winter months. However, if we're utilizing pasture when it's out there, when it's available, and when it's growing, it cuts down on the amount of forages that we have to harvest or purchase every year in order to provide for our animals nutritionally. There is a reduction in labor. So when we are grazing animals, it's a little bit easier to let them out on pasture than it might be to maintain them in a barn or some other type of shelter where you've got to clean that shelter, manage those animals. And the other thing too is that research does show that animals are healthier when they are on well-managed pastures. That doesn't mean that you can't have healthy animals in an enclosed setting. That's absolutely not true. You can manage animals well and in a barn type setting, and those animals will be healthy. However, if we are letting animals out on pasture, they've got less respiratory issues because they're outside. They're usually not as crowded as they might be in a covered facility. So there's a few less disease pressure and animal care pressure. So there is a reduction in that labor. And then finally, one other advantage is healthier kidding opportunity, but we say healthier with some air quotes around it. So theoretically, if animals are kidding on pasture, there's less risk for bacteria in that birthing area than there might be in an overcrowded barn situation. However, if it's muddy and cold and XYZ, that situation might not be ideal as well. The other advantage of grazing is that it does save money. So for anybody that's purchasing hay right now, you know how hard each of those checks is hitting your pockets. Hay is very expensive. And by grazing, we're able to utilize what's growing instead of having to purchase forages. The other thing with grazing is that we don't have to process and harvest those forages. So when we're grazing, the animals are doing the mowing for us, right? If we're going out and making dry hay or baleage hay, then we're having to pay for our labor, our fuel, our equipment use to go out and mow that hay, rake that hay, ted that hay, bale that hay. So with grazing, the animals are doing all of that work for us. Really quickly, here's just a little bit of an example that Amy put together to show you. So right now, as I mentioned, hay prices are insane, I guess, absolutely crazy as far as price variability and just how quickly it's gone up. So, this number, $280 a ton, last year I might have chuckled and said, Amy, you added an extra zero, but it's absolutely true and is even on the low side depending on the quality of your hay. So if you figure right now hay is running at $280 a ton, what could your cost savings potentially be if you graze the animals for just 180 days a year? So we're not talking about any type of managed grazing during the cold season months. So if we figured that on average, a 150-pound goat might consume 6 pounds of hay a day per goat per day times 180 days, that is just over half of a ton for that 180-day season that the goat would have to consume. So at this $280 a ton cost, the savings that you would have per goat would be about $150 each season. Now, this doesn't include fencing, doesn't include electricity, it doesn't include the lawn care when the animals get out in your neighbor's yard and you've got to go and fill in those ruts. But those expenses like fencing, for example, that is a one-time large expense that gets depreciated out over time with just some maintenance in between. Electricity is relatively low as compared to fuel costs to have equipment that would go out and harvest hay. So this number is kind of like a good reference number for you to think about, but there's definitely cost savings associated with grazing your animals on pasture well. Any questions or comments so far? Let me check here.
Looks like we're all good.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Other types of economic opportunities that come along with grazing animals. Right now, fertilizer prices for anybody who's purchased fertilizer are at least double what they were last year, and we're looking at the same prices next year as too. So again, if we're not harvesting that hay, we've got some energy savings there, but the animals are out in that pasture fertilizing the grasses for us, so we don't have to do that. So we're saving money from not having to apply fertilizer, and we're saving money from not having to use gas to apply that fertilizer. Additionally, I mentioned that there's some health advantages to grazing cattle if you're managing it well. And you can have reduced culling, which is when we are actively deciding to remove animals from the herd, for those of you who aren't familiar with what culling means. So that means, you have an animal that had a really hard kidding, just hasn't recovered. She's not dead, but you also don't want to keep her in your herd. So that would be culling. So research has shown that, you could go from a 35% culling rate to a 10% culling rate by grazing animals well. The other thing that I want to add too is that for any of you guys who have purchased or have tried to harvest dry hay, with the climate challenges that we're facing, it's getting even more difficult to find that 3 or 4 day stretch to try to dry hay out. So there's a lot of risk and a lot of variability when it comes to harvesting your own forages and trying to dry them and store them into the winter months. And we're really dependent on the weather. So by grazing, animals can still graze in the rain. They can still, collect and harvest that forage for us when we might not be able to. The other thing too is, we can't get out onto fields early in the spring with tractors and equipment, but goats and sheep can. So we're less weather dependent when we are actively grazing animals. So all of that good stuff, hopefully I've convinced you that grazing is for you. And now I'm going to tell you all the reasons that it might not be for you. So, Amy and I work with farmers, and we have a dairy farmer that we work with that says, I'm not a dairy farmer. Sorry, let me back up a second. We have a dairy farmer who actively and intensely grazes their cattle on pasture that they're rotating on a regular basis. And they say, I'm not a dairy farmer, I'm a pasture farmer, I'm a grass farmer. So it does require management. If you want to graze animals and have a healthy pasture, you have to actively work to have that situation. So you need to shift your mindset from, yes, I'm raising goats to farm them, but I'm also raising this pasture to raise my goats. So you actively have to care for and farm your forage. Next, designing a safe system is a must, and it's not easy, especially with goats. So the joke is whenever we have somebody call and ask what type of fence is going to work best for my goat and my pasture, my answer is an 8-foot concrete wall. So goats will always look for the greener grass and they will always try to get out. And you have to design a safe system for both the animal and yourself and the people around you. So for example, if you have a system where a goat might be getting out into, they might get scraped up as they're trying to get out of the fence. They might end up in a ditch someplace and end up with a broken leg. But then also for people, the goat could get out and make it to a road and somebody could hit the goat and severely damage their car and get injured. And if you have bucks, for example, they could get out. And if you've got little kids in your household or in your neighborhood, they could get out and seriously injure humans too. So we have to think about designing a safe pasture system that's safe for both the animals and us as farmers. There's also an increased chance of predation. So or predator pressure. So when we have goats in a barn, we can typically close them up and keep them safe that way. But when they're out on pasture where predators are naturally there, depending on what type of a system we have, predators have an easier access point. And we do hear from folks that lose kids to predators throughout the season, all the way up to full-grown adults too, depending on your predator pressure. And it's really tough to manage that economically in a way that makes economic sense when you have animals on pasture. Doesn't mean it's impossible, but it is another consideration. And then the final thing that I wanted to talk about too is that, pasture variability. So you might be working with pastures that are ready to go, and you can stick your animals out today. They're going to live. Everything's fine. You might also be working on a property where the pastures are poor. So you're looking at putting in the investment to do new pastures, or you have a big variability between your pastures. And the effectiveness of grazing animals depends on quality forage and quality pastures. So depending on what the variability is at your location, that can be a concern. And then we already kind of alluded to the liability part. So if you have animals on pasture, you have to follow fencing laws. You have to make sure that you've got secure fencing for those animals to stay on your property. And if they leave your property, you're liable for any types of damage that they might cause, which could range from damage to the neighbor's yard to, somebody hits an animal while driving their car and gets severely injured. So there are definitely liability concerns that come with pastures because there's a few more things that we can't quite control as much as we can if they are in an area like a barn. So we want to know from all of you if anybody's currently raising goats or grazing goats, excuse me. So let me go ahead and start this second poll here. So we want to know if you graze your goats, and options are yes, I just started. Yes, I've been grazing goats for a while. No, but I really want to, or I don't have goats yet. We'll leave this up again here for a few more seconds. Okay, Amy, you ready for these results? They're pretty, we've got a good audience tonight. So 100% of the people that responded to this poll said that they don't have goats yet, which is great. So we're going to teach you how to get started off on the right foot with pastures and parasite management, and you are in safe hands here, and we're glad that you're here. Okay, and any questions or comments at this point? I graze sheep, somebody said. Yes, that's okay too. We should have added that as like a slash goat slash sheep. Great. Okay. So the neat thing about goats that we often hear from people, let's say you purchased a property or you're managing a property that has a lot of shrubs. So you might have fields, but they've really grown up with some woodier perennial shrubs. You might have forested areas that you're looking to actively use for pasture. Goats are really good at eating things besides grass. So, the old cartoons where the goat's eating the tin can. I haven't seen that happen yet, but I'm sure it will at some point. But goats will eat a lot of things that we wouldn't expect. So goats do naturally consume some of those woodier perennials, things like young trees and seedlings, shrubs, and multiflora rows. So for an example, we actually, on my farm, we have cattle, and the cattle will not eat these things. So we run the goats with the cattle, and they help to keep our pastures clean with the native grasses and plants that we have growing, because they're going to eat the things that the cows don't. Same thing if you're grazing sheep and goats together. Sheep will tend to eat more grass and not shrubs, but goats will eat shrubs and young trees and multiflora rows. So if you have areas on your property that you're looking to get cleaned up, goats are a perfect fit. Another thing that we see too is if you have areas of a property that you can't quite get a lawnmower to, so maybe it's a little bit swampy, has some rough terrain, it's got a lot of multiflora rows, you can put goats on that and they will keep that eaten down and cleaned out. When we talk about grass and goats, you just heard me make a comment about sheep eating grass. Goats in general don't graze evenly. So when we let cattle out on pasture, for those of you who have never seen cows run into a new pasture, I definitely encourage you to watch it, because they are the most predictable creatures on the planet, and they really do efficiently graze. So they'll go around, do the outside, and then they'll graze from one side to the other, and all of the grass will be grazed evenly. Goats are not like that. So they're going to go find a corner or a spot that they really like, and they're going to eat that all the way down, while they leave grass or shrubs that can be really tall around them. Goats also have nimble lips, and that's what they use to browse, versus something like a cow that's using their very tough, very muscular tongue to grab and eat. So they're choosy with what they choose to eat. If you give goats the option between some really, young shrubs or types of woody perennials, they're going to go for those first before they go after the nasty, pokey multiflora rose or blackberry bushes. They're going to eat their favorite things and leave the rest. So they're not great at eating everything possible. They're going to cherry pick what they want to eat and then move down from there. So when we think about where we're going to be pasturing our goats and what we're going to try to be feeding them, for example, they're going to pick the stuff that they actually want first. And if you leave them there, they'll go for some stuff that they maybe don't want, but okay, whatever, human, I'll eat this. And then if you leave them there too long, they will potentially eat plants that could be toxic to them. So, we hear sometimes about toxic plants growing in our pastures, and for the most part, goats won't eat those as long as they have other things that they want to eat. But if they're put into a situation where they have to eat things down, they're going to go after those things that aren't their favorite, that could potentially injure their mouths as they're trying to eat it or be poisonous to them. If you've got goats on grass-based pastures, they're going to get tons of nutrition from that, and you're going to have a really high rate of gain. But because of all of these things, so they're not grazing easily, they're cherry picking what they're eating, you will need to clip pastures. So if we're managing our pastures well, what this might look like is we might let our goats out. They're out there for a set amount of time to eat. And then we're going to go out with a brush hog to brush hog everything that they left behind, so that our pastures are even, get rejuvenated, come back up the way that we want them to. So keep this in mind. It's not a let the goats out and everything's taken care of situation. When we're grazing goats, we do have to, one way that we keep our pastures healthy is by going out and clipping it after the goats have been in that area to graze. So why are we talking about all of this? In general, healthy pastures equals better productivity. So if we're grazing, for example, meat goats on a pasture or in a pasture setting, they're going to have higher rates of gain. So they're going to put weight on more efficiently and faster if they're on healthy pastures. If we're raising dairy goats or dairy sheep, they're going to produce more milk and higher protein and fat milk if they're on healthy pastures. So goats will survive on pastures that are not healthy, but their own health will take a dive because of that. So in general, goat health matches our pasture health, which is why we want to make sure that we're starting out with pastures. For those of you who aren't already raising goats, we're starting them on healthy pastures. And for those of you who are, we're actively managing our pastures to help increase the quality and productivity of those. So now we're going to get into a little bit more nitty-gritty pasture health stuff. And again, we don't have much time, so we're not expecting everybody to leave as master grazers and know everything there is to know about pasture, but we do want to kind of give you just a few tidbits to think about as you're getting started. So when we talk about raising goats, sheep, cows on pasture, it's important to kind of think about what's actually in our pastures to start with. And this can be done in two different ways. You move onto land, or you use land that's pasture and deal with what's there, or you actively and strategically plow and replant pasture or do some type of frost seeding to help improve pastures. So for goats, there's a few different things that we can think about as being in our pastures that we're going to actively manage. The first one, and the one that we're going to focus on the most, are perennial cool season grasses. And this is what we see most often across New York State. So these are things like orchard grass, timothy, brome, perennial rye. And I'll tell you that in general, when someone calls us and says, hey, I'm planting a pasture, or I'm starting a new pasture, what should I do? Or I want to frost seed a existing pasture to help improve the quality. This orchard grass, timothy grass, either of them as separate or a mixture. Usually we see them as a mixture with clover. This is the most common because it performs the best in our region. In other places across the country and in some cattle grazing situation, there also might be annual warm season grasses that your goats could potentially have access to. So this would be things like forage sorghum, small grains like oats, barley, and rye. So for example, farmers might use oats in a crop rotation, or as a way to start a new seeding of a pasture. You might, plant some timothy and some clover, but you also plant it with rye. So the rye provides cover for your new grass seeding. So you can graze animals on those annual warm season grasses. However, because they're an annual, you have to plant them every year, and that gets really expensive and hard to manage with pasture. So we usually only see that because it's part of a rotation with other crops you're growing, not because you're actively planting those grasses for your animals. And then there's my personal favorite, which is, I don't know. So we call it native grasses or native pastures. That means that you showed up, that pasture was there, and that's what you're going to feed your animals on, and who actually knows what's growing there. And the cool thing with goats is that they'll survive, right? So they'll eat down those native grasses. What we don't want is when we have our native weeds taking over our native grasses. So that's one thing to kind of keep an eye out for. But you absolutely positively can graze animals on existing pastures. You don't need to reseed it until you get into some issues where the pasture health just isn't the quality that you need for the animals that you're raising.
Hey, Caitlin, we have a question in the chat.
Perfect.
So what would work for fall grazing to extend our pasture season? Because we have a really short pasture season up here in upstate New York.
We do. So I actually have seen some people use these annual warm season grasses as an option. Again, it's just a little bit expensive to think about having to go out and plow and plant and purchase the seed and manage that every year. But in a situation where you have access to that, these annual season grasses will continue to produce throughout a little bit farther in the season. The other thing that I'll say too, and then I'll turn it over for Amy for her perspective, is that with these perennial cool season grasses, if we are actively managing them, planning out our time, they will continue to provide forage and nutrition for our animals even into the late fall season. So I've grazed animals all the way up to the beginning of December on pastures that we purposefully did not put them on in September, right? So we're making sure that we are saving time while those grasses are still growing, and actively managing that so that we're able to keep animals out on pasture before the 6 feet of snow shows up, and they're grazing on those grasses that we're able to grow. Amy, anything to add there as our pasture expert?
I think that's perfect. And some folks will leave some of that tall grass into the spring so you can get a jump on the grazing season too in some paddocks. The quality of that forage is going to be lower because it's been frost killed and it's been, snowed on and it's melted, snowed on and melted. So some of those nutrients have washed out. But that's another way that you can extend the grazing season, especially if you have animals that aren't in need of a high amount of energy. So maybe those growing animals rather than your late pregnancy or early lactation animals. So yeah, totally agree with Caitlin there.
Yeah, so it's absolutely doable. And that's the cool thing too about grazing animals is that we're able to be forage farmers in a time where nothing else is growing, right? So something to keep in mind is that if we're actively managing our pastures with the intent to graze them into the late season, totally doable to do it. And then the other type of forage that we have available in our pastures would be these shrubs. So shrubs, when Amy and I say shrubs, we mean multiflora rose, blackberries, arrowwood, literally any type of woody perennial that's growing tree seedlings. Those will provide nutritional value to goats, sheep, especially goats as they're grazing, because they will go after those leaves, and those leaves have nutritional value just like the grasses that we feed them does. And then finally, one other consideration when we're thinking about what's in our pastures that we're starting with would be to think about the soil quality. So if anybody was on our previous webinar about soil sampling for success, we do have that recording if you missed it. But knowing what your soil is can be really important for your pasture productivity. So no matter what you plant, whether you're actively pruning perennial grasses or annual grasses, they won't perform as well as they should if you're planting them into soil that has a low pH, that doesn't have the nutrients that those types of grasses are going to require. So if you've got pastures that are low soil quality, that pasture productivity is going to be a lot lower than if the soil quality was where it needs to be. We manage soil quality by testing it so that we know what we're dealing with. And then you can incorporate things like lime onto pastures. So you can broadcast lime onto a pasture without tilling it, and that will help manage your pH. You can broadcast fertilizers onto pastures without tilling it, and that will help improve your soil quality. If we're in a situation where we're reseeding new pastures, you can also be really choosy about using mixes of grasses instead of just planting one grass. So, I mentioned having an orchard Timothy clover mix, and those 3 plants can all work together to improve your soil quality. So anytime we're planting a legume, that will help improve the nitrogen and organic matter within our pastures, which improves the grasses that we want to grow, and helps them be of more quality. So it's important to know what types of soil quality, what your soil quality is and what you're working with. So in general, and because this is a topic that we could really get into the nitty gritty, we want to give you some, this is going to work ideas. So in general, when we're grazing animals, we like to use the idea of take half, leave half. So what this looks like is you might have a field, and once grasses get between 6 and 8 inches tall, that's when you let the animals out onto that field. You're going to take them out of that pasture when they might get down to 3 to 4 inches, 2 to 3 inches. So whatever's growing there, take half of that height, and that's when you need to pull those animals out of the pasture. If we graze below that minimum, so below the minimum of 3 to 4 inches, what can end up happening is that it reduces, or by grazing that way, by grazing take half, leave half, we're going to reduce the pressure on favorable forages. So weeds are opportunistic, so they're going to take over any chance that they get. So if we're making sure that we're managing this well for the grasses that we want to be there, we're making sure we're giving them the best start that we can. We also mentioned, talking about weeds with toxicity concerns. So if we are grazing that pasture, if we're not grazing that pasture to the point where goats are searching for whatever they can get because they've been on that for too long, we can help avoid some toxicity concerns. So by using the take half, leave half idea, they get to graze off of the top half that's good and be happy about it. And we're pulling them out of that pasture before they're down in the bottom half and trying to search for food. And at that point, they might select some of these toxic weeds that we don't want them to eat. And then additionally, if you've got clover that you're trying to grow up and you let the animals graze below that halfway point that we're kind of keeping as an idea, and I've got a picture on the next slide to help demonstrate what this looks like. Clover, for example, is really great because it does provide nitrogen to the soil as a legume, and we really love to see it in pastures. But if we're grazing too low, the animals can actually overgraze on that clover, which can cause some nutritional concerns for them. But more importantly, it can discourage the clover from regenerating and growing and getting established, which is, would be the ideal situation. So if we overgraze these pastures, we're not going to get that beneficial clover that we want. And in this next photo, we're going to talk about root mass. So root mass is absolutely critical to continue healthy, sustainable growth of pastures. And when we overgraze, we decrease root mass. So here's a photo, a diagram that actually shows what we were talking about. So this is the root mass. How deep are the roots that are providing nutrients to these plants? How deep are they? How far spread are they? What we want is a large amount of root mass so that it will, go farther into the soil for water in times of drought. It goes farther into the soil, which helps create drainage in times of a lot of rain. It goes farther into the soil to provide nutrients for those plants to grow, for those grasses to grow. What happens if we graze grasses below that take half, leave half scenario? There's less greenery for that plant to support roots. So it isn't able to increase its root mass. So when we overgraze, we're also discouraging the establishment of roots. So those plants over time will not be able to support the healthy pasture that we're going for. However, if we are leaving that minimum forage height at 3 to 4 inches, we're allowing for that plant to continue to grow roots. So when we are grazing it down a little bit, the plant says, hey, I need to keep growing, but it still has enough greenery and leafage to help support that plant and grow the roots. But when we graze it too far down, the plant says, oh, I need to grow more, but it doesn't have enough capacity to continue to grow roots. So hopefully that made sense, because it made sense in my head how I was explaining it, but now that it's coming out, I'm not 100% sure. So if anybody needs help with understanding why we're not grazing down, please make sure you let us know. This also includes shrubs. So if you are actively grazing shrubs with the intention of not killing them out. So, we talked about multiflora rose. We use goats as a way to control multiflora rose by overgrazing that so that it kills that out. However, if you have shrubs that you are actively growing as a forage source for your goats and you don't want that to die out, then you need to think about how often you're grazing and how intensively you're grazing on those. So for shrubs, we can only actually graze them between 1 and 2 times a year before this response gets over here, where there's not enough root mass to support the plant. There's not enough plants to support the root mass. So that's another thing to keep in mind. The take half, leave half also applies to shrubs. In general, leaving more forage at the end of a grazing period and a longer recovery period. So instead of sending those animals back out on that pasture 2 weeks later, we're giving it a month or even 2 months to recover. We're going to, over time, have more forage produced because those plants are healthier. They have a greater root system to support growth and to support productivity. So our production per acre, for example, is going to be a lot higher on grasses that we let the forage stay longer. Okay. So now we're going to talk about, go ahead, Amy.
Sorry, we have another question here in the chat. So this particular individual has more pasture than the animals can eat right now. And that's, something that's really commonly happening right now because we're in prime growth period for cool season grasses. So the question is how frequently and when is it critical to interject and take down pasture?
Yeah. So I'll give you kind of my rule of thumb and Amy can jump in from there. In general, if it's a healthy pasture with a good grass stand and a quality grass stand once a month is kind of what I use. So if the animals are out there right now and it's been, more than a month or just about a month since they were last out there and they can't keep up with the grasses, go out and clip that pasture. The other thing too that I've seen people do is if you have pastures where you just can't keep up with them with the animals that you have, in that case, then you might consider dividing that pasture out so they have smaller paddocks, which is, is a good segue into our next topic. But Amy, I'll let you kind of add what you think in case I wasn't interpreting that question right.
No, I think you were interpreting it correctly. That's the way that I interpreted it. So yeah, clipping is good for pasture health because once you clip it, you stimulate the plant to grow more. And it helps stop those troublesome weeds from going to seed. And that's a really big thing. So maybe your pasture is more spotty and, a little less full. Well, those weed seeds are going to take advantage of any bare spots. So clipping them off is going to help that way. Another thing that you can do, and this is actually a good management technique that I'll talk about in my presentation, is you can go ahead and make hay off of those pastures if they're big enough to run equipment on. So that way you're harvesting the forage because it's there. So, if you have the equipment, may as well. It helps reduce parasite burdens because you are getting that pasture low. And it's essentially free food for your animals for the winter. So yeah, free high quality food if you trim it before those plants go to seed.
Absolutely.
Yep.
And for those of you who need enabling and you're in this situation, then that sounds like you need to buy more goats. So there's that too. Good question. Or more cows. Okay, so now we're going to talk about different types of grazing. And again, this is just going to be an introduction to different types of grazing. So the three kind of main types that we see that we're going to talk about: continuous grazing, low intensity grazing, and high intensity grazing. We'll go into each of these a little bit more in depth, but just to give you an idea. Continuous grazing means you have one area that you put all of your animals in and they stay in there the entire time and you don't rotate them out until there's snow. Low intensity means maybe you have one or two paddocks and the animals get moved one or two times throughout the season, so they're staying on that area for longer than a month. High intensity grazing means you've got multiple paddocks and you're moving your animals regularly. This could be daily, this could be weekly. It means you're actively rotating your animals through to help maintain the health of the pasture that's growing there. One other term that we wanted to just throw in there because we say it and hope that people know what we mean, but there's something called stocking density. This stocking density is the measure of the number of animals per acre of pasture. So when we say, high intensity means your stocking density is high, it means you're putting a lot of animals in a smaller area for a short period of time. We might say low stocking density in a low intensity system because maybe you've got a field and you are only rotating through, once a month, but the animals that are in there, it's a low stocking density because you don't have a lot of animals in there. So the demand that they have to eat the pasture doesn't outweigh the amount of land that they have. In general, if you're thinking about space requirements, we consider 5 adult goats or sheep per year per acre. This doesn't include their kids. So if you have 5 adults and each of them have 10 kids, you're still good with that 5 adults per acre per year. Okay, so now we have another poll, which this one might be a moot point since the answers to our last poll were that nobody has goats yet. But for those of you who might have other animals or other types of farming experiences, we want to know if you have experiences with any of these, and it's multiple choice, so you can select all the ones that you have experience with. So not familiar, if you're just new to grazing; continued grazing, which means you have a large area that the animals are in over a season; high intensity grazing, which means you're actively moving animals weekly, usually weekly or daily; low intensity grazing, you've got some paddocks or some areas that you might be moving animals through from month to month. I'll leave this up here for just another second. And let's take a look at what everybody says. So we have some people that aren't familiar with grazing, but it looks like we've got a pretty good range of folks that are familiar with different types of grazing. So I think sometimes, for example, with low intensity grazing, maybe we have 2 pastures and we move our animals twice throughout the summer, we might not know that that really is low intensity grazing, and you are, managing that grazing by doing that small rotation. So I wanted to provide you with a few definitions and see what types of experiences everyone has. So thank you for sharing that. Actually, Amy, did those results come through, or was I the only one looking at them?
Nope, they came through.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. So now we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of each type of grazing and the pros and cons of those types. So the first one's continuous grazing. This is when we graze animals on a pasture at a low stocking density for a very extended period of time. This could be the entire season, or maybe even just one switch throughout the season. This means that there's very infrequent rest periods for the grasses that are growing. So there are always animals on that pasture grazing those plants, so they don't get a chance to rest and rejuvenate. In this type of grazing system, it's really, really easy to overgraze. What happens when we overgraze is that these grasses and the forages that we want to be growing can't recover because they don't get that period of rest and regrowth. So what ends up happening over time is that we get these big clumps of weeds. So weeds, again, are opportunistic plants. So if these forages can't grow fast enough to overpower the weeds, take over the nutrients, put the weeds in shade because the forages are able to recover, the grasses are able to grow the way we want them to, then we can end up with a widespread weed problem, because those are able to, they don't need a rest period, right? They're going to start growing right away. So in pastures that have continuous grazing, we do end up usually at points where we're battling a lot of weed pressure. The other thing that can happen with continuous grazing, which would be the opposite of weeds coming in, is just that nothing comes in. So you can actually graze grasses to the point where those roots just can't recover. They can't grow, they can't expand. And if the roots can't grow and expand, then the forage on the top also can't grow and expand. And we end up with these bare spots and very, very short grasses that never seem to get as high as they should be. So continuous grazing is something that we want to avoid if at all possible, but there's definitely some advantages to it, which is why people do it. So it has the lowest infrastructure costs, right? You make one fence around a field and that's it, you're done. It has the lowest labor costs. You're not trying to move animals over frequently or over periods of time. And just because continuous grazing can lead to these issues that we're going to talk about in a second, doesn't mean that it can't be, doesn't mean that it can't be done, and it can't be done well. So continuous grazing works best when livestock numbers are really low as compared to the amount of space. So what ends up happening, I mentioned that goats will kind of go out and find their favorite spots within pastures. What'll happen is if you have a large pasture and just a few goats in there, those goats will go find their corner, and that's where they're going to stay until they run out of food. And then they'll go find a new corner. Well, while they're in their new corner or their new spot in the field or under their favorite tree, for example, the grasses that they initially grazed on have enough time for that growth and rest and regrowth period. So continuous grazing can work. The pastures can be rejuvenated and grow on their own over time, but we have to be really careful and make sure that we're keeping our animal numbers low. Low intensity grazing is when we have paddocks and we're moving animals at a longer period of time. So it might be monthly instead of weekly or daily, like we're going to talk about next, but it's not, this is your pasture and you're going to stay here all the time situation as with continuous grazing. We want to moderately graze animals over time and make sure we're keeping an eye on the pasture. So if, for example, the pasture is low sooner than a month, we're making sure that we move them. The flip side to low intensity is high intensity grazing. So one example of high intensity grazing is the strip grazing. So you have this giant pasture, you divide it into strips, and the animals get to go into each strip and you're moving them daily or weekly or as needed. It's a lot of labor and it's a lot of work, but those plants, we're not letting them get overgrazed. And we're making sure that the animals get fresh new forage continually. There's also mob grazing. So with mob grazing, you're putting animals out at a higher stocking density than you might with other grazing systems. And you match that forage to the number of animals and the pasture size to the number of animals. So if you know you have X number of animals and they typically eat down this size of a pasture within a day or two, you're going to make sure you make your next pasture size the size that it needs to be to match those animals. Mob grazing, you let all of the animals out in a very small area and they eat that grass down right away. High intensity grazing is, most of us would consider the best case scenario, but there's reasons that people don't do it. So it has the highest labor costs and the highest fencing costs, but you're going to have the best control over the quality and the health of your pastures. You're giving those pastures the longest rest and regrowth times, because as the animals are moving through to different areas, it gives those areas that you grazed at the beginning of the season time to recuperate, regenerate, regrow, and outbeat weeds before the animals come back to that pasture. And with that, we have one more poll that we're going to throw here. And we want to kind of just do a check-in to see how everybody's doing. So let us know if you have gained something new from the presentation so far. Let us know if you think the grazing's for you. And the third question that'll pop up is if you'd like to learn more about grazing. So for the rest of the presentation, we will kind of transition to parasite management, which goes hand in hand with grazing. I'll leave this up here for a second. Amy, I'm looking at the time. Do you want to take a break or charge forward?
I think we should take a little bit of a break because that was a lot of information in one fell swoop.
Yes.
And then what I'll do is I'll do a more broad overview of parasite management. We're not going to go into too many details, but there's a lot of videos and things that we can use as resources for watching on your own. So we won't miss any of the content. It'll just be a little bit of homework for you to do.
Perfect. I think that sounds like a great plan.
Awesome.
I will go ahead and end this poll. We can look at how everybody's doing. Nobody said they haven't learned anything. So that's good. We're doing good, Amy.
Awesome.
Sounds like we haven't convinced anybody that grazing's not for them. So we're doing good there too. And lots of people want to learn more about grazing. So this helps Amy and I because we are always wondering about, which topics should we go super in depth in and what shouldn't we? So what might end up coming out of this is another hour and a half that's just focused on grazing and plant selection and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, well, we're going to go ahead and let's take a 5-minute break. So everybody get here a little bit before 7. I'll run a commercial. So if you hear music in the background, that's what that is. But let's try to be back a little bit before 7 and we'll switch gears to parasite management. Okay, so we're gonna welcome everybody back with another poll as we transition into parasite management. And while Amy's presenting, you'll see how it matches up with pasture management and why we put these two topics together. But we want to know what you already know about parasites. So your options are they can get them, but it's no big deal. They can get them and it's a huge deal, or goats have parasites, ew, right? So we'll leave this up for a second while everybody's rejoining us, and then we'll see where everyone's at. Okay. So let me go ahead and share the results. Nobody thinks that it's not a big deal. So the word parasites can sound really scary. So hopefully we scared everybody with this question. We do have a good chunk of people that say, yeah, it's a huge deal. And another chunk of people that say, oh, goats have parasites. Tell me more. So Amy, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sounds good. All right, I'm just doing a quick flip here. Sorry for making you dizzy. All right, so we went through our third poll. Okay, great. So I get the fun job of talking about all of the gross things that goats can get. And as many of you indicated who know about goat parasites, they're a huge deal. And they're a huge deal because some of these parasites have started coming up from the south. And, you know, regardless of where they've been coming from, our sheep and goats are just not resistant to them. And they cause some pretty severe reactions, including death. So for that reason, we're going to focus on a little bit on them and then how we can manage our pastures to help reduce parasite burdens within the animal. No matter what we do, they're always going to have parasites, but we can limit the number of parasites they get and how those parasites proliferate within the herd. I'm going to touch on 4 different parasites for you right now. These are the 4 that I've heard about in New York State. There are others, but they're not as common or they don't cause as large of production losses. So that's why I want to focus our attention on these 4. The first and most, let's say, most predominant is going to be barber pole worm. And the reason why it's called barber pole worm is because the female worm in this photo looks like a barber pole, the white and red candy stripe. And these are very prolific. They live in the true stomach of all small ruminants. And what they do is they latch into the stomach wall and they consume blood. They will consume up to 1/5 of the animal's blood volume a day. And so if an infestation is really severe, that animal can't replenish its red blood cells fast enough for it to maintain its normal daily functions. And so that animal will pass. It causes severe anemia. A lot of times it can cause death. And it is the #1 cause of parasitic related death among sheep and goats. When we talk about FAMACHA a little later on in the presentation, this is a way that we can gauge parasite burdens. That is focusing on barber pole worm. Okay, so the next is liver fluke. So liver fluke is really interesting because it's not an innate parasite of sheep and goats. Instead, it does its reproductive cycle in white-tailed deer, and it does a second part of its reproductive cycle in snails and slugs. So essentially you need 2 things for this thing to show up on your farm. You need deer, which I'm pretty sure most of us have, and slugs, which I don't know if you've walked the pastures lately, but yeah, your legs get kind of wet. That's from slug slime. So in any case, we have these around, and what they are is essentially, they kind of look like a stingray. They're not as wide, but they're fluted. So they kind of float through whatever they're munching on, which in this case is liver. They will range in size from about the size of a pea to the size of a golf ball. And just one of these flukes, especially if it's a larger one, can just move its way through the liver. And upon necropsy, so once an animal passes and you open it up to see why it died, some of these animals with liver flukes have livers that look like cottage cheese, barely held together with sinew. It's really devastating. And unfortunately, without a liver that's fully intact and functioning, an animal ceases to live. So these are really important for us to manage around. Oh, and I'm not progressing. There we go. Okay. Meningeal worm is one of those things that we're starting to see more often. And again, it's the exact same life cycle as the deer fluke. So it needs to pass through a white-tailed deer into a snail or slug, and then the slug slime or slug gets consumed by our goats. And with meningeal worm, goats or sheep are not the typical host of this parasite, so there's no innate resistance to it. And so once it gets into the body, it causes issues. It doesn't cause issues in the white-tailed deer, unfortunately, but it does cause issues in our domestic species. So essentially what it does is it gets into the digestive tract through the consumption of that contaminated forage. And these meningeal worms move through the gut lining and into the brain and spinal cord. And once they're there, they wreak havoc. You know, your brain spinal cord's not supposed to have anything other than cerebral spinal fluid in it. And once you get a worm in there moving around, it just makes things a little wonky. And so a lot of animals who have this will have lameness, paralysis, or they'll get an itch that they just can't scratch and they'll itch themselves raw, simply because they feel that there's an itch there, but it's not there. It's all psychological. And then the last one's not a worm. This is actually a protozoa, I believe. So it's coccidia. We may have heard of coccidia in other species as well. The good news is coccidia don't transfer species. So if you have chickens running with your goats, you're not going to pass coccidiosis back and forth. But sheep and goats can share some coccidia parasites. In any case, these little bugs are found in warm, damp environments. So if you've got a barn with bedded pack, maybe it's a little wetter than you'd like, or maybe you have a barn that doesn't have bedded pack that you just scrape, and maybe it hasn't been scraped for a little while. These are environments that allow coccidia to build up. And so they do part of their reproductive cycle in the animal and part of it on the floor of the barn or pasture or barnyard, wherever they happen to be. Most of the time it's going to be in a barn or barnyard. It's usually not in pasture because we are moving our animals so frequently that these little guys can't complete their life cycles, which is awesome. But in any case, what happens is a goat will pick this up by feeding off the floor, and they will, they're accidentally ingesting feces from other animals, which has some of these parasites in it. And the parasites will then go into the intestine and they'll just wreak havoc. They'll just put little pock marks everywhere, and they're feeding off of the nutrients of the goat. So that goat is a little less thrifty. And that goat also can't absorb nutrients because not only are the parasites stealing it, but the parasites are also damaging the intestinal wall, which reduces the amount of absorption. So this is 100% deadly if not treated. And if you treat it, you got to treat the whole herd. So we could talk about that more another day, but I just want to let you know that it's out there. It is a thing. We can treat for it. So that's the good news, but just be mindful that it is around. As we look at our small ruminants, we use something called a 5-point check to determine the internal parasite status. So this is for all parasites in general, and this is basically showing that when we look at an animal, we want to have bright eyes. We don't want to have nasal discharge. We want to have a really nice, shiny, full coat, no diarrhea. And we want to make sure that the body condition or the amount of muscle and fat on that animal is appropriate for that animal, and they're not wasting away from maybe a parasite burden. So we can go through these checks to determine that. Generally, an overall overview of an animal, you can say right away, yep, that one looks sick. Yep, that one looks okay. And we actually have a whole bunch of videos that we recorded for actually, if you attended the Looking to Buy a Goat session that we had, gosh, it was probably about 2 months ago now. We recorded a whole bunch of videos around this whole 5-point check. And these videos I'm not going to play for you just because we don't have time. But if you haven't seen them, they go over how to look for these things on a live animal. So we wrangled some goats. We had a whole lot of fun. And hopefully you'll learn something from these videos if you haven't already watched them. When we evaluate for anemia, one of the main ways to do this is through something called FAMACHA. And remember, this is for us to determine the amount of parasite burden for a barber pole worm. So one of the most devastating baddies that we can get in our goats. And what FAMACHA is essentially, it's us comparing the inner eyelid membranes of a sheep or a goat to a card, which has colors on it. And those colors correspond with how much blood there is in the animal system. So if the animal's really anemic, it's going to be a really light pink or white color of the membranes. And if the animal's healthy, it's going to be more towards a deep salmon pink to a bright red. And we can go ahead, test this, and based on those test results, we decide who to selectively deworm in that herd. This is going into FAMACHA a little bit, but generally deworming the whole herd at certain times of the year is no longer recommended because of increased parasite resistance to insecticides, essentially. So what we do is we find those animals that are least thrifty, that look bad from the 5-point check, that have anemia, and then we go ahead and treat those animals, and that helps us maintain a population of parasites that is only semi-resistant to our drugs rather than fully resistant to our drugs. So Caitlin, are you gonna play this video or should I pull it up?
Yep, I've got it up here.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yep, let me just take over the screen share and there we go.
So this is how to go through an actual FAMACHA test. Note that the video is only 1 minute and 15 seconds, and Dr. Zajac is talking through this in pretty immense detail. So when we do it ourselves, it actually doesn't take that long.
I was actually thinking too, we should probably show this video twice, or at least the actual popping part.
Yes, I totally agree.
Okay, great.
Catherine now is going to demonstrate our procedure for exposing the mucous membranes so that you can match them to the card. And the first step is to cover the eye with the skin of the upper eyelid so you can't even see the eyeball. Then push down on the eyeball, pull down on the lower eyelid, and you'll see those mucous membranes pop into view. So this is what we're scoring, that nice, beautiful bed of mucous membranes, and you can see how prominently they stand out. Now, if Catherine did not push down and cover the eyeball and push on the eyeball, what she would show is only the margin of the lower eyelid right here. And that is not what you want to score, because usually that scores paler than the mucous membranes themselves will, that bed of mucous membranes.
Okay, so I'll drag it back to the cover, push, pop part.
Cover, push, pull, pop.
Yes, just so we can see it one more time.
The skin of the upper eyelid so you can't even see the eyeball. Then push down on the eyeball, pull down on the lower eyelid, and you'll see those mucous membranes pop into view. So this is what we're scoring, that nice, beautiful bed of mucous membranes, and you can see how prominently they stand out. Now, if Catherine...
Yep. So this is part of a training called FAMACHA. Usually these are, so you could take it online at the University of Rhode Island, or you could take them in person. So there are specialists across the state who will host these events. And both of them will teach you the same stuff, but they're about 2 hours in length to complete. And once you complete it, you can go ahead and get the FAMACHA card. And so you have to complete the training to get that card that Dr. Zajac was showing next to the mucous membranes. And part of that is because you have to practice that push, that cover, push, pull, pop technique. Got it. In order with a certified trainer, so that you're not harming the goats and you are showing the mucous membrane properly. But so that's just a general taste of that. And if you're interested, we could definitely focus more on that in a future webinar.
And we'll also, in your follow-up information, we'll include the link so that if you're interested in taking the FAMACHA training online, there's options to do this entirely online. In person's always better because you have other people that commiserate with you and someone right there, but you can get your FAMACHA certification without having to attend an in-person training.
Yep. And I'll just throw out a shameless plug. If you're in Southwest New York or close to the region, we're actually planning on hosting one in Cattaraugus County coming up this fall. So in person, that'll be a whole lot of fun. All right. So let me check my time here. Okay. 15 minutes. this is timed pretty well. So let's talk about using Pasture as an integrative pest management tool. And what integrated pest management is essentially, how do we manage our environment to decrease the use of dewormers and to also manage the health of our charges. The first is pasture height. So Caitlin focused a lot on pasture height in terms of the grass being able to regrow at the optimum speed and lushness. And the reality is that pasture height, the minimum that we want, actually correlates pretty well with what we want to see on pastures for sheep and goats in terms of keeping them healthy. So this image is actually a blade of grass. So the main stem of the grass and the leaf blade, and in it is a droplet of water. So maybe this is some dew that slid down the leaf, and in it are the infective larvae of barber poleworms. So when our sheep and goats are infected, which they are, trust me, and they go to the bathroom on the pasture, what happens is that these parasites will go through the cycle to become infective between 3 and 30 days, depending on the environment. So under proper conditions, warm, wet, these guys can become infective in 2 to 3 days. So anyway, these parasites will sit in the first 2 to 3 inches of forage. And that's because they're deposited on the ground. So they don't move very far. They're very small. And so when we keep our pasture height, that grazing minimum, when we graze down to 3 to 6 inches or so before we move our animals, that's not only for pasture health, but that's to keep the parasites at bay. Time on pasture, I alluded to this just a second ago, but we want about a pasture rotation of 3 to 5 days during the optimal parasite reproductive season, if we can. And in continuous grazing situations, we can't change where our animals are on pasture, for instance, but if we can, that 3 to 5 days is optimal. So once those animals are rotated off of pasture, it's generally recommended that those animals stay off for 60 days. So just say you have 2 pastures and you generally like low intensity graze, right? So you don't have 1, you have, 2. You could put the animals in there for a little while, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. And then, after 2 months, go ahead and switch the pastures or the paddocks so that animals are then put onto a non-infected pasture, and that infected pasture is allowed to let those parasites run their life cycle and die off. So that's a way that we can go ahead and manage for these baddies.
We do have a question that kind of goes along with time on pasture.
Mhm.
So in early spring, when the barns are heating up, but the pasture isn't quite there yet in height, is it best to be on pasture, or is there a temperature that marks the time to move out of the winter barn?
It's not temperature so much as it is what the grass is telling us. So this comes back to being forage farmers as well as livestock farmers. Usually when that grass gets up to 6 to 8 inches, we can start to let our animals out on that. That said, in the spring, our pastures are really, really lush. And so we need to be really careful to wean our animals off of hay and onto pasture in order to prevent something called grass tetany, which is essentially, it's an imbalance of ions in the body. Don't worry about it. Just know that you need to wean animals onto pasture, especially lush green pasture. But yeah, the pasture will tell you. So sometimes these cool season grasses can be ready to graze, just say mid-April one year and mid-May another year. It's highly dependent on the year and the temperatures and how high the grass was going into winter and all sorts of fun things like that. Do you have anything to add, Caitlin?
I would just add that like this year, for example, for a lot of farms that I work with, was actually a really good example of the temperature was too high too quick to put animals out on pasture. So what had happened is we had those couple of weeks of really high temperatures with not a ton of precipitation. So temperature wise, you might have said, hey, it's time to move my goats out, but the pastures weren't growing yet. So we were still dealing with very low, very sparse pasture growth. So even though the temperature was high, the pastures weren't ready for the animals to come out. And if you had, let the animals out on the pasture, they would have overgrazed that a lot very quickly to the point that you might have sacrificed that pasture for the entire season. So we really want to pay attention to what the pastures are telling us, regardless of the weather, because it does depend on precipitation and weather, but also we want to make sure that we're starting the season off well. So some things that you could do if the barns are feeling really warm, but the pastures aren't quite there yet, open up the doors, let the animals out in a small pasture that, you know, you're willing to sacrifice, quote unquote, for the season for short periods of time. Giving them some other things to help manage that temperature, but making sure we're keeping an eye on the pasture height too.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Thank you. All right, so here's a couple other pasture management tactics. We can graze with multi-species grazing, and this is most effective for parasite management when we follow our goats with another species, not sheep, because sheep and goats share parasites, but they don't share parasites with cows, with horses, with chickens, with pigs. So if you have multiple species on your farm, you can help manage the pasture so it doesn't get ahead of you by releasing another species behind your goats in order to keep that grass height down. We talked about mowing pastures for hay, and another way that we can manage this is plant graze and browse species. So goats tend to eat up just naturally. They don't want to eat on the ground if they don't have to, because that's how nature made them. So if you plant browse species such as shrubs on purpose for the goats to graze, or if you fence off an area where there's a lot of these browse species for the goats, this could be a way to manage parasites because the goats aren't eating down in that 2 to 3 inches where the infective larvae are. So this could help you out a whole lot. One other thing I want to mention with making hay, in addition to pasture management, is that once you make hay, the infective larvae essentially die during the drying process. They don't have enough moisture to live. So that is a way that we can get a co-product off of the pasture and also not risk reinfecting our animals with it. We talked a little bit about using strategic dewormers through our introduction of FAMACHA. So more or less what that means is only deworm the animals that absolutely need it. If they don't need it, don't deworm them. It's better for your pocketbook. It's better for the animals because deworming does have a little bit of stress associated with it. And it's better for parasite resistance management. So actually the link to the FAMACHA training is in the presentation, but we'll include it in the email as well. So in general, I think this is my last slide. I want to leave you with the idea that, while we're managing pastures for production, we're also managing for parasites, and those two aren't mutually exclusive. They actually go hand in hand, and they benefit both you and the goats from many perspectives. So we hope that if you haven't tried grazing, that this presentation has given you enough knowledge to get started. And as you start grazing your animals, if you encounter questions, contact us and we'll be able to help you out, whether that be us answering your questions directly or forwarding them to a specialist in your region who can help you out. So with that, we will go ahead and put up our 5th poll. So will you complete our follow-up survey?
And we should note too that this follow-up survey will automatically pop up once we close out of the webinar, and a link to it will be in your follow-up email. The reason that we're asking for this is for those of you who attended our first goat workshop, we took the things that you told us you wanted to learn more about, things you wanted to change, and incorporated those into this workshop and the next 2 that we're doing. So we really do read those survey reports, and they're very helpful for us and very helpful for our grant providers too that are enabling us to have this series. Okay, so good news is, Amy, we're going to have some survey results to look at.
Thank you, guys. All right. So I do have one more slide here. Well, 2 more slides. So here's our resource slide with all of the resources that we mentioned tonight, as well as some resources for general farm business starting and risk management things. And we would like to thank you again for your participation tonight. We do have 2 upcoming goat webinars, again, based on your what you have said in the survey. So the next one is Baby Mama Drama, which is reproduction and kidding. We'll basically go over what to have available before kidding season starts, things to look out for in terms of mama and baby health, just all focused around that nature. And then we will have another presentation on July 13th, goat herd and foot health. Feet are one of the most important parts of a goat because they wander around eating forage all day. So we'll talk about how to hoof trim and how to look for signs of disease in hooves, as well as general health of the herd. And both are free, both are at the same time. So we hope that you will sign up and attend with us. And if not, that's okay. We can send you the recording or we can catch up later.
Great. So with that, Amy and I will stay on here for a little bit. So please continue to put your questions in the chat. We did hope that these topics we talked about tonight would make you think of some other things that you wanted to know or questions about the topic, and that's what we're here for. So we have a couple questions. First one, if you do need to deworm a mom and they're feeding babies on pasture, are the babies still fine to eat from mom, or should you separate them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say read the label of your dewormer. So the label is law. The label has all of the information on it as to whether or not it's going to affect lactating does and their kids. So I would go ahead and read the label. There are some that are fine to use. And so you should be able to find something that you could treat them with. And when we check for parasites, we're checking for those probably every 2 weeks, 10 days to 14 days. So it's a continuous check all throughout the life cycle of those animals. Good question.
Mm-hmm. So I've got a couple other questions here. Is it possible to raise many different varieties of animals this person's raising on pasture and do so organically?
Yeah, I think so. So what organic essentially means is managing without conventional inputs. So things like conventional feed, conventional herbicides and pesticides. So absolutely you can. It's just a different grazing system.
Right, absolutely. And are there certain species or breeds that are easier to raise on pasture?
Caitlin, I'll have you take that one first.
So I have to chuckle. Sorry, I have to chuckle a little bit. I actually, research-based information aside, I raise boar goats, which are kind of like the prima donnas of goats, right? Like they're very, very selective about what they eat. They're very whiny about everything, and don't want to work hard for food. So they would not, they're goats that are raised for meat and are typically finished in shelter situations, and we're trying to push them really hard to graze. So it's definitely doable regardless of breed, I would say, and even species too, right? So you can pasture most of these animals that we raise for meat and dairy are biologically suited to get the majority of their nutrients and energy from pasture. So totally possible to graze whatever you want to graze. But I think that there is variability between breeds. More importantly, there's variability between management styles and pasture availability. So if you're trying to raise boar goats, for example, the prima donna goats on pasture, and it's not well-maintained pasture, they're gonna be extra whiny because there's nothing there that they want to participate in eating. Same thing with dairy goats. So another consideration too is if you're raising dairy goats, you have to think about, the pasture that they're on is going to change throughout the season, and it'll actually change their milk composition throughout the season. So if you're making cheese out of goat milk, it'll change the type of cheese and the way your cheese turns out over the season. So it's another kind of consideration. So you absolutely can raise different species and different breeds on pasture. And I would say that breed does play sometimes into the success of that pasture, but it's all things that you can manage around. Anything to add, Amy?
No, that's perfect. I knew you'd throw in an example about the boar prima donnas, so that's why I threw it to you. But for real though.
For real, we have one right now that I have to, if you want to talk about managing pasture, I have to go out and literally push one of our bucks out the barn door. So he will like venture outside. He's the biggest prima donna, can't handle heat, can't handle like getting his own food. So it's all about management. And if you have the time and patience to push your goat out the barn every day. Okay, any other questions or comments? We will awkward pause here for a little bit, just in case people need some time to type those in.
So I did see one just pop up. So do we have any electric netting company recommendations? And unfortunately, because of where we work, for the university, we cannot give individual company recommendations. What I would say is there are several homesteading groups across the internet that would be really good to pose this question to see what has happened in their experience with those particular net types. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add, Caitlin.
Yeah, neighbors. So if you
That's
drive
true.
around and you see somebody with electric fencing and their goats are not out, stop by and ask, because they'll be super proud that their goats aren't out. So I find, best recommendations are just other neighbors in your area and see what they're using. Because again, we did have somebody that commented in here. So Amy and I won't say it out loud so it doesn't get dinged on a recording, but other farmers are really great people to talk to get to those specific brand name supplies.
Right. And another thing to mention is that the management of your goats and how well they're trained, or sheep, and how well they're trained to the netting before you put them out will vastly increase your level of success with any netting of any kind. So electric netting on its own is not going to keep a sheep or goat in unless they understand that they will get a shock if they run into it. So there is a training aspect that needs to occur with electric netting.
And because goats are super picky, if they're happy where they're at, they're not going to test that electric netting or whatever type of fence you're using as much as if they're not happy. So one of the advantages of managing our pastures really well is that we're keeping those goats happy. So they're going to be less encouraged to test those fences. But also, if you have goats and they keep getting out, don't get discouraged. There's a reason that I jokingly say you need an 8-foot concrete wall to keep them in, because sometimes you really do need an 8-foot concrete wall to keep them in. So we try to do the best that we can by using high quality electric netting or fencing and making sure that there's good things in those pastures that they want to stay there and eat.
Yep.
All right. Well, I think with that, we thank all of you for your time. Again, when you close out of this, there will be an automatic survey that pops up. We hope to see you at our next 2 meetings. And in the survey, if there were topics that we didn't get to that you were really hoping we would cover, please let us know so that then we can plan to host future workshops on these topics as well. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. And we hope you have a good night. We hope to see you in 2 weeks.
All right. Thanks and good night.